Well, welcome today to the EdGate Powers podcast. I'm your host, Richard Portelance, and I am thrilled that today we're talking with Jill Pierce from the Tennessee Educational Technology Association. She is the executive director, and our topic is managing adoptions. Jill has a long background in technology, and so what we're trying to do today is we're going to take this and turn it on its head a little bit, because schools have to have certain technology components in place in order to adopt new products. And Jill's history and background is in that tech space. She's got plenty of experience, and I'm thrilled that you're here with us today. Jill, I'll let you give the audience a little introduction, and then we'll jump into it.
Well, thank you, Rich. I really appreciate it. Yes, I've been in education and educational technology for over 30 years. Was a CTO in 2 districts in the state of Tennessee, and work exclusively with school districts all over now. But I'm retired, and I now work for the Tennessee Education Technology Association that provides support to schools, EdTech programs and things like that. So enough about me.
I know you're humble in your approach, Jill, and I appreciate that. As a CTO and someone who has worked with technology, I have a technology background as well, to a certain extent, not nearly anything like yours, but I know there's things in the background that can cause people to stumble, programs to stall. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit. From your perspective today, we're here in 2025 and heading into the fall semester. What are some of the biggest things that cause school districts consternation as they're adopting new technologies? What are you seeing that's kind of coming to the forefront?
Well, I think schools are having to be a lot more, lacking of a better word, I think they have to do evaluations. It's not a new thing, but they're really having to look at how they're stretched their dollars. And so when they're doing any type of evaluation and working with their instructional people, because there's 2 lines in a school district. There's the instructional piece of technology, and then there's the operational piece. Depending on what you're looking at to implement, or it's about educating a kid, or it's about streamlining services that we use in schools. So when you talk about the educational side, it's about looking at what that's going to provide that child. Is it a resource, a supplemental? And then how does it interact? What information do I have to have in that program to make it successful? And then what training I have to do. So as a school district, they're constantly evaluating those particular products that assist that teacher in educating that child. So I do think that it's very important as we look at this, who knows? I mean, when we think about 2025, and I think about when I started my career back in the 90s, it's a lot different conversation, and the conversation now is we have so many options. How do I make the best choice for that child and for what that teacher needs to educate that child appropriately? On the operations side, it's the opposite. It's like, okay, what's going to streamline our operation so we can concentrate more on that child? So, those are the kind of questions we've got to ask in technology. But, then you add the things on top: interoperability, cybersecurity, those kind of things. So I do think it's a lot deeper conversation that we have than we had, over 20 years ago.
Well, I love the way you divided that between how do you educate and how do you streamline. If I'm going to look at the streamline side first, I'm in a school. I've got probably 50 vendors coming at me with new whiz bang products, I have an infrastructure that has to support some of those, and I have to make choices about which ones I'm bringing on. How am I starting to think about dividing out those products and making a short list of things that will work with my infrastructure? Because you talked about that streamlining. If I kind of took a look at that box, what are some of the things those the technologists and the educational technologists are looking at to allow for products to fit into the box that's being built for housing those technologies?
Well, the first thing you've got to know is what the need is. Okay. So whether it's instructional or operational, there's a need there when you buy something. We need to do this, or we need to improve this. And in most cases in schools, now the comment is we need to improve this. We know what we need to do to get the job done, but it's about, and not always buying the new shiny tool. It's about being appropriate with it. Because if you implemented new tools every year, you're not going to get anything done. So it's also recognizing what your needs are. So
Yeah.
once you let's say we identify a need. Once I identify that need, then the thing that I would do as a CTO is start looking for those vendors that provide things that with that need, or look at existing vendors that are already providing something and see if they could provide that need. So, because it's if I could do an add-on to an existing product or an enhancement, or instead of buying a new one, that's less implementation time and training. So again, it's about the school district recognizing what their needs are from there. And then once that's done, once we know what the need is, it's about figuring out, okay, who can provide that need. So then you go out and you do research. There's lots of places you can go and find out different things. And then, when we talk about then it's an evaluation process. And then you start asking questions. Okay, how do you interface with our student management system? What type of data are you collecting? Do we need to make sure that you follow cybersecurity rules and data privacy? So you start getting a lot of questions that you look at, and you create you a checklist. So that checklist would say, okay, we know it provides this need, but can it do these other things that are required to keep a child safe? So you just start down that list. So that's usually how I started. I start with the checklist. Here's my need, and then here's the things that it needs to have to provide that need. And then on top of that, I have a checklist that says, okay, here's the things that it has to have to work in my district, from student data privacy to cybersecurity to interoperability, all of those things. And so once I have that checklist, then I can start talking to vendors to get an idea before I create my RFP to try to buy it. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. If I'm an EdTech provider, then what I'm hearing you say if I'm working in the school on the technology, I'm building these lists. But if I'm an EdTech provider, you can be a better provider if you understand the ecosystem. You can understand the needs of the district before you come in, and you can hone in on where I can create some interoperability, where I can, create some, how do I make it easier for the technology team and for the district, so that I'm not just saying, hey, my tool is great. I'm saying it fills a need, it's improving upon your systems, etc. Right?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. There's two ways a vendor approaches you. One is you've got that need, and we've talked about how school district goes about it, and we're going to go out and reach to those districts we feel like that can fill that. I mean, to that vendor that we can fill that need. The other side is the vendor coming to the district and saying, hey, I've got this need. It may be something that I didn't even realize we needed as a CTO. But in those cases, when a vendor comes in like that, it's not where I'm going out to them. Then they really need to know the those questions up front, because the first thing I'm going to say is, well, yeah, that might be a need for us, but I'm going to start asking those questions. Well, how do you interface? What's your student data privacy? If there's personal information that's shared between that product and them, how, one of the big questions is support. How do you support that product? How do you support us with training? So, you know, when you talk about that, all of those questions, if I'm looking as a school district, I've already got those questions ready and I'm reaching out to vendors that. But if a vendor's coming to us and saying, hey, and lacking of a better thing, I've got the best new toothbrush, you know, I've got a brand new toothbrush that's going to make everything easier in your life. Well, they've got to be able to answer those questions if they're talking to a district, because if they can't answer those questions, that district's going to shut them down immediately, because it's not just about having the best new toothbrush. It's also about being able to work and be efficient when it comes into my system, whether I buy that product or not.
That's fantastic, and that makes a lot of sense. If we take one component of, because you talked about a lot of different needs, data privacy and interoperability and support, etc. Let's talk about cybersecurity for a minute, because I think that's on everybody's mind right now. You know, if as a school district, what kinds of things are you looking for? What are the parameters that you're setting in Tennessee so that you know, things are secure?
That's a really tough question, because there's actually two lines of cybersecurity. It's about keeping your data safe, and then it's about stopping intrusions, which go hand in hand. So, you know, what a lot of people forget about schools in general is that the majority of our users are under the age of 18. So protecting their data is vital. And you know, the rule is you do the very best you can to protect them, no matter what. So any vendor that I'm talking to, one of the first questions is, okay, how are you going to keep my data safe? Okay. If something happens, how are you going to respond? And then you start having those conversations, you know, what do you do to keep our data safe? You've got to be able to answer those questions. I don't want to get too technical here, because if I start throwing out a lot of technical terms, the worst thing about technology and education is we use a lot of acronyms, and it becomes this acronym thing. And the problem is that those are two industries, education and technology, that use a lot, and sometimes it gets people confused. But you know, we're talking specifically about cybersecurity and data privacy, because they go hand in hand. Is I need that vendor to be very clear on how they keep that student data safe or my employee data safe, and then how do they protect from intrusion to the individual with how we use their product. But, and I would say that that's one thing, and I don't mean to kind of go off, but the other thing is, how do you keep them safe? And then how easy is it to use your product and implement it? Those are two questions that I think are at the foremost. Now, those questions come, but it still has to provide a need for that school district, whether it's instructional or operational. If somebody comes in with something that's just not needed, I'm not going to have a conversation with that vendor, because you've got to provide a need if you're coming in. And what you think that need's important may not be to that school district. So like I always used to tell vendors when they come in, I said, did you even look at our website to see what our needs were? Because in a lot of cases, school websites will have their strategic plan, what they're working on, and you can kind of get a priority of what the needs are for the school, because it's a, you know, I think it's very important when you come in and you talk to a school district that you can answer those questions.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, my background, I did that for about 10 years with Career Path, which was my product. And, I learned after a period of time that understanding those priorities through the strategic plans was critical. You couldn't have conversations if you didn't read those documents and understand. And if your stuff doesn't fit, if it's not in the strategic vision of the school, then you shouldn't go knocking on the door, because then you're just wasting people's time. You've joined up the cyber and the student data privacy, and I agree that they need to be put together. When we talk about interoperability, what are some of the leading things that you're seeing today?
That word's been thrown around a lot, and I use it myself. But if we break it down to the most simplest thing for somebody, it's about how your product integrates with what I already have. Yep. And how easy is it for me to get my data into that program so we could use it. And again, there's a lot of different programs out there, but majority of the programs that interact with kids or operations has to have some kind of account to run it. So in most cases, schools now have a data management system that manages all their users. And when they hook a program to that, it feeds those information. So interoperability, and I'm being very simplistic here because you can get in the weeds with that too, is about making sure that product works interchangeably with everything else you have. I think that's the very simple definition, but it's going to be very important that when anybody comes into my district, that they can answer that question. Because here's the deal, and this sounds really hokey, but it's the truth. Teachers hate clicking on icons. The more things that I can put into one interface where they can access all their stuff, and the more that my end users in operations can log in and operate all of their stuff, if it integrates with whatever we're using to be like a centralized, basically to access any type of application for either instruction or operations, then that helps my users use it on a more often than going out and looking for a separate icon. Yep. So when we use products that basically provides one interface that programs feed into, we want to make sure that that program that we're buying or product that we're losing will integrate with those types of things that we already have in the school district. It also depends on the need. It's always about when you're adopting something, it's always about adaptation. Is the product important enough that if it doesn't integrate exactly with everything else, does it provide a service that's worth me doing something outside what our norm is? So it's very important when a vendor used to talk to me, or even when I talk to them today, that they can answer those questions. Okay, how do you interface? I can tell horror stories back in the day where vendors could not answer those questions. And I'm like, you don't need to be talking to me till you can bring somebody in to answer those questions, because, I'll bring my engineer in. Well, at that point, I'm wasting 2 meetings. And again, everybody's time's relative.
That's a great point. If you're working in a school district, people know how busy teachers are and professionals in schools. There's not a lot of downtime, so getting your time wasted is I'm sure something that's not very appreciated. If you're looking at making sure that, and I liked your description of simplifying the icons, making sure that the user experience is a quality one, that you're not sending the teacher or the student off to wild goose chases. That doesn't make any sense. So are there any leading systems today that you're leaning on? Do you have a LMS that is predominant in Tennessee that you see out there?
I think a lot of school districts use a product called ClassLink, and what ClassLink does is it allows you to integrate all those different icons where the teacher logs in or the student logs into one interface, and it has everything right there at their fingertips. They're probably one of the leading companies right now. Not an endorsement from them. It's just from what I've seen. There's other companies there. You'll hear the term Clever. Clever does that too.
Yep.
And they all, but those are probably the two top products that schools are using to integrate their systems, because it's about making, you won't, when you buy a technology product, you want it to fit that need that you have for your students or for operations. But then from there, you're going to back up. Okay, well, this fits the need. So maybe let me back up. I'm sorry. I don't want to get too down in the ditches here. So let's say I find two products that do the same thing and they provide a need for my district. So how do I figure out which product is the better one to use? Well, then that's when we start asking those questions. Okay, how easy is it to train on your product? Do I look? And those decisions aren't typically made only by that CTO. At that point, I'm going to bring in a team that has teachers, my technicians, school districts that work in silos. It really can not necessarily. So it's really important that you have a team that's made up of the end users that you're going to be dealing with and saying, hey, I want you to look at this. Give me your critique on it. Is it easy to use? I would have my techs in there that would, say, well, it's going to take us this long to introduce because it does this, this, and this. When you talk about all those things, at that point, it becomes a communication thing. So when a vendor comes in and they're providing a need, they've got to be able to answer those questions as we start talking to them. And then as we go through the evaluation process, which we do in most cases, we're going to see if this vendor has what they need, or is there something else out there that provides better for us. And so it's like, okay, product A and product B, they both provide the same need, but product B has a better interface. It's easier for us to train on. So at that point, product B we're looking at. And again, price plays into it, but it's about, when we do RFPs or we look about buying, it's about lowest and best, not cheapest.
That's a great way to define it.
Yeah. So when you talk about that, we want to be, schools want to be good stewards of tax dollars, but we also don't want to be where we're not thinking about time, because time, that old adage, time is money. Time is instruction time in schools. It's money too, but it's about how can I get the biggest bang for my buck. And if it's a product that's really cheap, but it doesn't do all those things about support, training, interface, it's probably not worth buying, even though it's the cheapest. So you've got to kind of weigh those things.
Yep. No, for sure. That makes a ton of sense. In terms of communication, because you're bringing up and talking about this, answering questions that are out there on, integration and about, how do I support? How would you like to see that? Do you want to have a meeting with, or does a district want to have a meeting with a vendor, or do they want to get that material in first so they can make a better evaluation? What's the best way to deliver the communications so it can be clear?
That's a tough question, because I think about my career and when we bought things. A lot of things that I've seen is because of me going to a conference and talking to that vendor because I saw what they had. And then I would invite, their salesperson in to have a longer conversation. Here's our need, that if I initiate it. I've had vendors call me and schedule meetings. But again, before I usually scheduled a meeting, was it a need of something that we might want to look at? I think a lot of people, just because of time, don't want to schedule time with vendors if that vendor is providing something that they don't see on the radar right now. So I think there's both sides of that, but I do think it's very important that if you're engaging the school district first, you've got to be able to answer all those questions. If you say, hey, I see y'all have a need for this, we do XYZ, then they've got to be able to answer that question. And if that salesperson can't answer that question, they need to make sure when they do that meeting that they have people on there that can. Since COVID, it's really funny. We've had the option of doing virtual meetings long before COVID happened, but now because of COVID, everybody's doing virtual meetings. So, but even with that takes time. So if I'm scheduling a virtual meeting with a vendor or they're scheduling with me, I've got to make sure that they hit one of those criteria. And I need, before we have a conversation that's something that I'm going to look at to buy, they've got to be able to answer all those questions like we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That I appreciate that. I think that's going to be helpful to people who are listening. And if you are, listening to this, you're on the EdGate podcast, and we're talking to Jill Pierce, and she's giving us a lot of great information on the inside workings of districts and states on the technology front, what they're looking at in terms of cybersecurity, student privacy, data interoperability, support, and all the important things when it comes to launching new or managing existing products in a classroom. And ultimately, we're going to start talking a little bit more about how that affects the student, the end user, because having whiz bang new products are great, but if it's not affecting change in the classroom, then I'm sure, Jill, that's going to play a huge role. So when you're talking to teachers, how are you coming up with some of these strategic plans? What are some of the processes that go into saying, hey, we need something new because there's a need not being met? What does that look like?
Well, I think first and foremost, your strategic plan is done by your school board. So they work. So basically, it's a team effort. So the board says we want to do, and then the superintendent gets together. They'll talk to their leads in the school district of the different departments and say, okay, here's our needs. And then we start working on what are the priorities. That when you have a strategic plan that a school board follows, and you say our part, and I'll just use an example, our priority is to make sure that every third grade child is proficient by the time they leave third grade. Okay, what do we need to do to make that happen? So at that point, if that's a strategic goal, your board knows that they can apply money to that because that's on the priority list. So that's where you do that. Now, the thing that's kind of a little makes kind of a, chicken and egg type of thing is that to make that happen, what other things have got to happen around that you didn't think about? Because that's the goal. So what do I need to do? So we're going to buy 2 or 3 instructional products and do specific training with teachers on them. Well, then I have to look around. Okay, do we have enough devices to support it? So as you start doing it, it's really about a plan, and then and figuring out the things around to implement that specific priority with fidelity. We use that term a lot in education because it's a very simple word, but it means that we looked at everything to make sure that we give this particular priority the best shot to be reached. So when we say we do things with fidelity, and fidelity can mean a lot of things around it. It's about communicating. If I'm a CTO in a district, I've got to make sure I've got the instructional people on, our special ed, population, our director there on task, our principals, and then the teachers in the classroom. So at that point, we've got to have committees to say, all right, let's look. What do we need to do to reach this third grade goal? And what resources do we need to have around it to make that happen? And sometimes it's not all tech, but again, we use tech to supplement a lot of those goals in a sense. from the device to the product, from the instructional product to the cybersecurity. You got to make sure you got good Wi-Fi in every classroom, and then it becomes this thing. Okay, what funding sources do we need to use to do that? But I have found with most school districts, if it's on their strategic plan and it's a priority, the money tends to be sent to help it do. And that's where it's very important that a superintendent has good people around them, and that we can convey what is needed in those particular instances. So from a vendor standpoint, those are the type of things. It may be that vendor doesn't provide that instructional tool that helps in that goal, but they provide some of the, wiring and routers and things to make sure that product's working effectively on the network in that school. Again, those are wide examples, but it kind of gives you an idea.
Yeah, that gives us a great idea. And I want to remind everybody, we're going to have a webinar on September 10th, 2025. Jill will be joining us. We're going to be talking about how leading EdTech companies are managing adoptions and winning contracts. And obviously, Jill has amazing experience in the background of schools and with EdTech and how they're being implemented, how they're being rolled out to ensure students are getting the best quality and teachers are not becoming overwhelmed with new whiz-bangy things. So please be sure to join us. There'll be a link in the description below so you can sign up for the webinar. And, we'll also have some other guests on that podcast. So Jill, you were talking a little bit there about the, I love the word fidelity, by the way. I think it's a great descriptive word. It brings to mind clarity, understanding, and when you have that fidelity between the administration, the teachers, the technologists, it helps simplify the roadmap. And you were talking about the strategic plan being the core element. So as you're creating that strategic plan, I'm sure you've sat on teams and boards over the past 30 years and played a role in the development of those strategic plans. What are some of the critical components today, in 2025 that are going into those plans? And if I'm a vendor, what should I be looking at?
Well, I think it's funny. Actually, yesterday I was with some new superintendents here in Tennessee, and a school district superintendent got up and was talking about how the strategic plan should work. And obviously the strategic plan is for your school board, but then it's up to the superintendent and the personnel to implement parts of that to make sure, because it's at the end of the day, when you think about a strategic plan, again, it's about those children, and we've got to keep that focus. And whether it's instruction or operations, everything's around those kids. How do we provide those services for those children to make them successful when they leave school, period? And I get it. I get told a lot. I'm a little Pollyanna because of that. But I feel like that as long as a company's coming in and they're saying, okay, we know that we provide a good product, we're looking at these things. Every strategic plan I've ever seen is based on the needs of the school, or it's based on the needs that they have to acquire via standards, state regulations, federal regulations, whatever that is. And hopefully all of those are to the benefit of that child. Career Tech is a real good example. Career Tech has grown leaps and bounds than what it was when it first started years ago. And now kids can actually look for what type of career they want to go into. And that's part of their everyday instruction. So when you look at strategic planning for your board, it's about identifying those areas that they want to either improve well, in most cases improve, or things that they need to enhance because they're good at, they're already really good at them, but how do we make them better? A good example for a kid is this: you've got a very high achieving child. How do you make sure that they're always achieving if they're already high achieving? And that's, that's one of the hard parts for a lot of school districts. So when you think about those kind of things and you're thinking about vendors coming in, it's about being able to answer those questions. Now, not that there's not products out there that don't necessarily fit specifically in a strategic plan. It may be about operations, ease of use I always think back when I was over grounds and facilities. I think back, when we looked at lighting in the school and those kind of things. Those necessarily aren't in the strategic plan, but it was very important that we had good lighting in the rooms for the kids, or when we bought panels in a classroom, it was about not using projectors, so the teacher had to turn the lights out, because turning the lights out is not good for kids during class. It ends up when lights are out, kids like to fall asleep. I get it. So we put panels in every classroom because it was a better instructional tool. It doesn't necessarily fit directly in that strategic plan, but it was a need to make sure we had the best technology available to give that atmosphere for that child to learn in.
I think, as I'm listening to you, where my head was going was this idea of supporting all learners well, right? And so whether it's the lighting in the classroom or if it's a technology that may meet the mainstream, but it doesn't advance the advanced learner or help the delayed learner in some way, then maybe it's not the best technology. So if I'm a vendor, I have to think about that. If, is my content adopted up and down the best, or is my technology able to speed up or slow down or create some preferences so that student isn't feeling either left out or left behind, right?
Well, I also think that, there's a lot of, it'd be great if everything fit in a round hole, but the problem is there's a lot of square things out there, as they say. So it's about figuring out what's going to be best for that environment for that child, or best to keep the operational parts, because the operations from water to food, and then accounting, making sure people get paid, all of those things are part of what keeps a good school district running. And so when you're looking from the tech side, whether it's, again, operational or curricular, instructional, those are the type of decisions that have to be made. I mean, we think about cameras, for security, making sure that they're working correctly, and what kind of services we need to do that, and how do we keep that safe, and door access. I mean, all of those are operational things and safety things. They don't necessarily directly affect the classroom, but it does. If a kid doesn't feel safe in their school, they're not going to learn. If parents don't feel their kids are safe in school, they're not going to send them. So, all of those things come back to the environment of the child. Let's give them the best environment and the best instruction, and so they'll learn, and opportunities. So I do think that those are all things that fit into it. And if I'm a vendor, I've got to know how my product fits into that scenario.
Yeah. And tell me, within Tennessee today, is there any kind of, it may be sweeping or it may not exist within the districts, about the use of cell phones in the classroom and students' access? What are you guys doing there?
Well, here's the funny part. Just July 1, we have a new state law that no wireless devices can be used in the school except for emergency and instruction. That's a new state law. And I paraphrase there because it's a lot longer law than that. And I want to make that very clear. You can look it up. Tennessee Code Annotated. But so a lot of schools that just started here in Tennessee are having to adapt what that is. So we're one of, I think, 3 states, I may be wrong there, that have adopted that law. So basically, it's getting rid of any type of wireless device that's not used for direct instruction or safety. And so, bottom line, and when I say safety, that's not really the law, but that's kind of the interpretation. And that means the kids can't have their cell phones, and every school's doing a little bit different to make sure they're compliant with the law. So yeah, it's a new day.
Yeah, it is.
What that looks like. But and I'm a lot of this is coming from screen time. I also think kids being consumed with social media and those kind of things like that. So we're seeing a lot of new laws that affect how we make decisions on things like that.
So when you couple that with it's not quite the advent, but it's I would say we're at the forefront of AI, how that's infiltrating life, classrooms. How do those couple together? How does AI affect what's happening in the classroom today? And how are schools bringing that all to bear?
We have a law on AI, and basically the law says that we will evaluate and use appropriately for instruction, those kind of things. Here's the deal. And what a lot of people don't realize is AI has been in our life. A lower form of AI has been in our lives for 20 years. If you've used spell check or some of those products that help you with that kind of stuff, they're a form of basic AI. So we have to be really careful here. AI is a very broad term. So it's very much up to the school districts to figure out where AI falls for them. The other thing about AI that's been very important is, where does AI get its data, and where does AI use if you use any type of personal information? So again, this goes back to student data privacy, employee privacy. So those are the questions that are being asked with AI. AI is a very strong and powerful tool, but we also have to say, okay, what we're doing, these are actually some of the same questions we asked when the internet became really available several years ago, and I'm aging myself, but we're asking some of the same questions. And don't get me wrong, AI is a lot more powerful than just a browser, but it is some of the same questions. How are we going to use it effectively? Is it safe? When it first came out, teachers worried about cheating.
Yeah.
I think, and we still have some that do that, but in most cases, if it's used appropriately, it can be a great enhancement to a child's day and to teachers' work. Every school district's kind of taken a little bit different, but I think on the forefront of AI products is making sure that data is protected, because I think that's going to be, your student data, student personal data, your employees. Right now, that's probably the biggest out, even though you find this powerful tool, that's the thing that a lot of people concentrate, because where does that data go in this AI product? So I do think that's going to be the conversation, and we're nowhere near done with it, because those AI products, and besides AI products on their own showing up like ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini, you've also got a lot of companies that are adding AI to their existing products. So then you have to go back. So let's say it's a product I buy as a school district. I've got to go back and have the conversation. Well, how's this AI being used in this product? Is it affect my student privacy? So we're really having to have new conversations, because everybody's adding an AI component.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you brought it back to student data privacy, because it should always come back to that. If we're implementing new products and like you said, AI, there's been components around for years, but people are starting to realize, and it's becoming more and more powerful, and it's building steam. There are great advantages there, but if you're not protecting the student, then it really can't be used. My question is Tennessee developing kind of rules for all the districts that apply, or is it left up to the districts to make up their own rules?
What do you mean when you say rules? I mean, we have to follow state law and national law. That goes without saying. And there is a there is a state law for AI here in Tennessee. A lot of states have it.
Yeah.
Some, yes, but once we see where the state law is, then the school district figures out how they're going to use AI appropriate to that state law. It's just like with any other state law. When you talk about wireless devices, so we have only using wireless device for instruction. It's up to the school to define, because at the end of the day, you still want to give that school district and teachers the ability to address, because they're seeing those students every day. So we want to follow our state and federal laws, but then it's about getting down and educating that child and giving those opportunities for them to be successful after they leave. So I do think that there's some decision making. All that decision making still falls on the school district and those people that make those decisions. Now, I do think is it a miss when any vendor comes in and they don't know what the state laws are.
That's where I was going to go next. Last year we talked to the guys from Texas, TEA, and they're kind of consultants, and they emphasized how important it is to understand the legislative agenda. What are the laws coming down? What's happening? Because if you're going to go into the districts, if you don't know that information, you could be completely off base and
that's
people's time.
Yeah, and that's very important, because if I went to New York, they have a very strict data privacy law. California does. So it's very important that you know what the laws are, or if you know that there's a law coming down that's going to be implemented within the next year. Because and I've seen this happen in my career. A vendor brings a product to a school district. It's a great product, and they weren't aware that there's a law that was actually going through the legislature that most of us knew that was going to pass, that would make their product not be available to use.
Yep.
And they didn't know that. And all they had to do is make a couple of changes and it'd been fine. But we knew that law was going on the books. I won't get into specifics, obviously, but we knew that law was probably going to be passed, and there was no way we could buy that product as is. And the vendor wasn't aware of it. So, and I get that sometimes it's hard as a national company to know what all the state laws are. But in every case, every state has a place you can go to search for their state laws. Every state has it, and you can go in there. There's a couple of places that brings all the state laws for EdTech in. And so it's very advantageous that you have somebody at that company that's keeping their salespeople abreast about what's going on in that state. Because if you don't, it's a good way to get the door shut in your face.
You're wasting a lot of people's time and
Exactly.
your own as well.
Exactly.
Well, Jill, clearly you and I could sit here and I could probably ask you 1,000 more questions, and you're going to have 1,000 more outstanding answers. But I think we have to be conscious of time. So I'm going to ask you if there's any final thoughts regarding these elements, and just to kind of repeat, we've talked about the student data privacy, the cyber. We've talked about interoperability. We've talked about being, having good support for your product and making sure you understand the legislative environment within the state. So there's a lot of things that vendors need to understand before they try to sell a product. If you're going to put a wrap on this, Jill, any final thoughts here?
I would just say this: if I was in the vendor row, I would just make sure, and just one statement: do my homework. Do my homework, be ready to do. And if I can't do the homework, I need to have somebody that can, and because it's going to be very important. And I always live this: you want to lead with kindness. Be conscious of school personnel's time. So, because sometimes that can mean as much about getting in the door as it doesn't. Because if you can't have a conversation with that district, it's not going to mean much to that vendor anyway, because I won't be able to get in the door. So that's my 2 cents, whether they mean anything or not.
I think they mean a lot. Jill Pierce, thank you so much for kind of enlightening us of what's happening in Tennessee, but more generally, I mean, all these things are ideas that can be applied to any state, any district, and to me, this was a really informative conversation for the EdGate Powers podcast. I'm looking forward to having you as a guest on our upcoming webinar. That's going to be fun. And we can extend this conversation. So thank you for your time today. And I'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay. Thanks a lot.